A plane with a difficult fate, in which there is even a place for a classic arc with the death and resurrection of the protagonist. A plane that managed to be both completely Soviet and half American, and now completely Russian. Hello aviators, Sky here, and today, with soda and popcorn, we will be watching a new chapter of the great experiment called Can One Country Completely Independently Make Airplanes? I present to you the IL-114.
Экипаж благодарит вас за аплодисменты и за ваше внимание, и за вашу любовь.
The early 1980s were a period of great change in the world of regional air travel. This niche was mostly occupied by turboprop aircraft, which were created back in the 1950s and were considered a temporary compromise to the cool and fast but expensive and voracious jet aircraft that were expected to come here later. Over time, jet planes got much better, but the oil crisis that broke out drove up fuel prices, making them unprofitable again. So, the aviation industry, after evaluating all the conditions, came to the conclusion that the turboprop is not a temporary solution, but quite the ruler of certain niches. You can't put them on long-distance routes, but on short routes it's quite good. It was then, in the early 1980s, that many projects were initiated, the results of which were the machines we all know: the Embraer 120, Dash 8 and Saab 340, ATR 42, Fokker 50, and so on. In the USSR, by the beginning of the 1980s, the approach had a similar agenda. The small influence of fuel prices made it possible to successfully operate kerosene killers, like the Yak-40, but it could not completely cover the needs of Airflot. A significant part of the local and regional traffic was taken by simple and undemanding turboprops, such as the An-24. And it was the same with it as with the rest. It was outdated and had to be replaced by a new one, better in everything, but still a turboprop. This topic was actively worked on by the Ilyushin Design Bureau. Having collected all the data, they decided not to overthink and start scaling. A fashionable topic for that time, Yakovlev just recently made its Yak-42, which was an enlarged Yak-40, and the Ilyushins, on the contrary, made a kind of smaller Il-18. It ended up being a low-wing aircraft, not quite usual for the class. Most of the colleagues are high-wing aircraft. Quite simple in design, but with advanced onboard equipment, which finally made it possible to make a cockpit for two, without a flight engineer. According to various estimates, the internal demand of the USSR reached 1,500 of such machines. By 1985, the initiative work of the Design Bureau reached the leadership of the USSR, which initiated a full-fledged program. This is how the IL-114 was born. The capacity of the new aircraft was planned at the level of 60 seats, a range of about 1,000 kilometers, a speed of about 500 kilometers per hour. Everything was more or less at the level of all aircraft of this class created at that time. But there were also differences. Interest in the machine was shown by the military, who successfully operated various versions of the Il-18 and saw in the Il-114 its successor. They wanted the aircraft to be able to stay in the air up to 10-11 hours, performing the tasks of a patrol, reconnaissance, anti-submarine vehicle, and so on. In order to achieve such performance, it was decided to work on a combination of the aerodynamics of an airframe and the large wing with the efficiency of low-power engines. This way, the plane could fly for as long as possible, and the large wing helped during takeoffs and landings. Foreign aircraft were created differently. They had a smaller wing, and the better takeoff and landing performance was achieved due to the greater power of the engines. And the difference is actually striking. The wing of the Il-114 is huge, its span is several meters larger than that of foreign colleagues, and the total area, almost 82 square meters, is bigger almost by a half. Even the hefty 90-seat Q400 has a whopping 18 squares less wing area. This coolness has a price. The hefty wing, despite the optimization, turned out to be quite heavy, which was reflected in the entire aircraft. The weight of an empty Il-114 was at the level of 16 tons, and this is a lot. For example, the ATR 72 or Saab 2000 weigh about 13.5 tons. Meanwhile, the maximum takeoff weight for all is almost the same, around the mark of 23 tons. With all the reservations, a couple of extra tons of structure for, in general, not a very large aircraft is not good. They could try to lighten the structure using composites, but on a small plane the return would also be small, and the cost and complexity of maintenance would jump noticeably. If a stone flies into a carbon fiber panel on an unpaved runway, that's it. Good luck patching it up there. But those were the requirements of customers, and they did it. Despite the fact that the Design Bureau was experiencing a shortage of resources, in parallel they were conducting a large IL-96 project, the work was carried out actively. In the spring of 1990, the prototype made its maiden flight, and by 1992, the aircraft was supposed to enter the lines. Production was prepared at the Chkalov Aviation Plant in Tashkent and at the Moscow Aircraft Plant. Alas, the grandiose plans for the IL-114 collapsed, along with the country that created it. The loss of industrial ties, cutbacks in funding, and the failure of the prototype meant that the test program went from short and easy to long and torturous. The IL-114 reached a certificate only in 1997. The same problems exacerbated the initial issues of the innovative machine. The TV7-117 engine had an advanced design and good fuel efficiency, but it was heavy and frankly crude, unreliable and short-lived. Very short-lived. Its flight resource was almost 6 to 7 times less than foreign counterparts. Soviet-designed avionics quickly became outdated. The low wing turned out to be too low. It was impossible to extend the flaps completely. There was a risk of touching the ground. Trying to solve these problems, Ilyushin and the Tashkent aircraft plant, which remained the only production site, began to create modifications. The shortcomings of the systems were solved radically. They were replaced with foreign ones. This applied to onboard equipment, cabins, and engines. Eventually, the IL-114 ended up being almost half foreign. But there was almost no demand. In terrible economic conditions, no one wanted to take a rather expensive and at the same time problematic aircraft. There was an attempt to cooperate with Iran, but there the An-140 snatched the cake. The Iranians have already created their own local version on its basis, which received the name Simorg. As a result, the Uzbek airline Uzbekistan Havo Yulari, the current Uzbekistan Airways, which supported the domestic Tashkent aircraft factory, became the main operator of the IL. In total, over all these years, 20 aircraft were made, and the production in Tashkent by 2012 also came to a close. It would seem that the IL-114 is yet another sad story of a late Soviet aircraft that did not survive the crisis. But its story did not end at all. In 2016, the Russian government decided to resume production of the IL-114, and this decision caused a lot of controversy. On the one hand, this task is not easy. It is impossible to just resume production. It must in fact be deployed from scratch. In addition, it is not enough to return the IL-114. It must be seriously modernized. That aircraft from the 1990s is now completely uncompetitive. The question may arise, wouldn't it be easier to make a new aircraft? Defenders of the project point out that with all the problems, the IL-114 is conceptually not outdated at all. All of its colleagues are the same age, surpassing it in components, but not in general. It turns out that a completely new project will require an ocean of time and a mountain of money, which may not be available, resulting in approximately the same aircraft. In the end, it was calculated that it would be optimal to use the IL-114 as a base, which would save money, and to direct more resources specifically to modernization of components. Yes, this is a compromise. Yes, it is not so epic, but let's be honest, there were many epic projects in Russia, and most of them did not leave the presentations. It would be nice to see the plane, not the plastic model at the exhibition. This was the beginning of the project, which received the IL-114-300 index. The deadlines for the implementation of the new program were planned to be rather short, and in order to speed up the work, it was decided to use one of the serial airliners already in storage to test the new systems. This plane took off in 2020 and is now in front of us. Let's see what they have done and how promising it is. And immediately, disappointment for the revolutionaries. Outwardly, they did not seriously change anything. The length of the airliner is 26.9 meters, height 9.2 meters, wingspan 30 meters. Yes, the wing that caused so much controversy remained in place, and it is still huge. Well, the attention of the military to the machine as well as their requirements have not changed, especially since the military versions of the Il-18 have clearly not grown any younger over the past 40 years. However, the wing is not quite the same. They optimized some of the elements and slightly increased the dihedral angle, bent it up. This gave more space for both propellers and high-lift devices, saving it from the nasty limitation of full flap extension, which impaired takeoff and landing performance. The landing gear of the aircraft is tricycle, rather squat, to preserve the ability to work on unpaved runways. All legs are equipped with two-wheeled bogies. The power plant of the IL-114 is located in large engine nacelles, integrated into the wing of the aircraft from above and moved significantly forward. Below, in the same fairings, are niches for the main landing gear. It was curious to see these toothy fairings at the back, near the nozzle. The design is almost the same as that of the Il-18, except that it is smaller overall. The main problem of the Il-114 was the engine. The TV7-117S was a good motor, but its low resource, large mass, insufficient power, and unreliability offset all the advantages, dragging the entire aircraft down. But over the years, the engine builders have gotten it to work and improved it, adapting in addition to the Il-114 to the Il-112 transport, and in the turbo shaft version to the Mi-38 helicopter. The result of their work was the TV7-117 ST-01. It received new electronic controls, optimized components, became lighter, and increased power. 2800 horsepower on takeoff, with a maximum of 3100 horsepower. This is approximately 12 to 14% more than the base engine. The resource indicators, probably the most critical for the engine, have grown to 8,000 hours. That is, compared to the first engines of the series, almost 10 times more. The auxiliary power unit remained in place, but was also upgraded. They could of course go into exotics and teach the engine to work in the APU mode, abandoning a separate generator, something like the hotel mode on the ATRs, but it was decided not to add unnecessary risks. Modernization did not bypass another problematic element: propellers. 6-bladed SV-34 propellers were installed on the base Il-114. Not bad for their time, now they are already outdated. The IL-114-300s received new propellers, 6-bladed saber-shaped AV-112-114. Compared to the SV-34, they have become more efficient, quieter, lighter, and more durable. The cruising speed of the aircraft remained the same, about 500 km per hour, with a closed practical ceiling of 7,600 meters. However, more powerful engines and fully functional high-lift devices gave results. The aircraft accelerates faster on takeoff, and with a lower minimum flight speed, it is also faster to slow down. As a result, it needs about 750 meters for the takeoff run and about 550 meters to land. This is almost half the parameters of the base Il-114. The mass of the structure was also reduced, slightly, a little more than a ton, but this made it possible to increase the mass of the payload, and with the remaining maximum takeoff weight, the fuel supply. This gave a greater range. If earlier it was at the level of 1,000 kilometers, now it reaches 1,400 kilometers with 64 passengers. The fuselage of the Il-114 has a width of 2.86 meters, with a cabin width of 2.64 meters, slightly above the average in the class. The aircraft has several doors, standard and emergency. The main door in the front is equipped with a retractable air stair, again to minimize airfield equipment requirements. It will not be possible to show the cabin of the prototype because it is not there yet. The interior of the base IL could accommodate up to 64 passengers in a 4-seat in a row layout according to the 2+2 scheme. It was not badly equipped, but by our time of course it is very outdated. The IL-114-300 will receive a completely new cabin, hardly surprising, but at the level of other modern aircraft in the class. Its capacity will remain at the level of 64 seats, with the possibility of adding one more row and making 68 seats. The main comfort issue for turboprop aircraft is the rather high level of noise and vibrations. They were working on it even on the early Ilyushins. The engines were moved forward with minimal direct contact with the wing. Vibration decoupling and noise absorption materials were used in the design. In principle, all these methods are relevant now. Some manufacturers have gone further and installed active noise reduction systems on their aircraft. It is hard to say whether it will happen on the IL. It is not a cheap pleasure. One of the important achievements of the Ilyushin Design Bureau was the creation of a cockpit for 2 pilots. At that time, it was an advanced solution, but now it is already mandatory, which makes some other late Soviet aircraft irrelevant. The onboard equipment advanced for the USSR quickly became obsolete, and over time was replaced by American systems. Now, the creators of the IL-114-300 are faced with the task of creating a new, modern cockpit which would be completely Russian and not inferior to analogs. The creators of avionics have a lot of work to do. The same thing needs to be done on the Russian SSJ New and the MC-21 airliners. In theory, it should be fine. Not Gulfstream, of course, but good enough for the regionals. The Ilyushin Aviation Complex and the MiG company are leading the project. The former are engaged in the aircraft itself, and the latter provide a production site, the aircraft factory in Lukhavitsy, southeast of Moscow. Many companies and factories took part in cooperation within the program. In parallel, a lot of work began on the formation of a life cycle support system, spare parts warehouses, maintenance centers, staff training, and so on. A subtle factor, the shortcomings of which, as practice shows, can become a huge problem. Plans for the production of the aircraft were not epic, but quite vigorous. Starting from the 2021, they were going to produce 12 aircraft a year. It was always beautiful on paper. In 2020, the pandemic struck, which considerably slowed down everything. A big blow to the program came in the summer of 2021, when the IL-112V transport prototype crashed in the Moscow region. You'd think, what does another aircraft have to do with anything? But the investigation showed that the cause of the crash was the fire in the TV7-117ST engine, the same as that of the IL-114. As a result, the supply of engines was suspended until their shortcomings were resolved, along with the program for the production and certification of the aircraft. Then there was 2022. Which on the one hand made the IL-114 much more relevant and necessary, and on the other probably greatly complicated the work. But the program, albeit with delays, continued to develop. The first orders for the aircraft were received, and the plant continued to assemble a couple more prototypes, which soon will have to take part in the test program. The engine meanwhile passed checks and additional tests, and at the beginning of 2023 was certified. Well, the aviation experiment continues. In the regional market of Russia, due to the limited ability to work with foreign aircraft, the SSJ-100 received a strong boost, and is now waiting for modernization and replacement of foreign systems with Russian ones. In its own niche, the IL is expected to dominate. The IL-114-300 is a compromise in everything. On the one hand, as we can see, there is nothing particularly cool in it. In all respects, it is a very average aircraft. On the other hand, for all its mediocrity, it can be considered more or less at the level of colleagues, and will remain relevant, at least until someone else brings something completely new and cool to the market. In the meantime, taking the ILs into the park and replacing old machines with them should not be too painful for operators. In theory. Well, I think I can end my speeches here. I would like to wish good luck to all the participants of the IL-114-300 program, and see these aircraft in the airline fleets as soon as possible. And you, lovers of everything flying, get yourselves into the comments and don't forget to like the video along the way. And if you want to watch the videos early, see some exclusive behind-the-scenes content, or just support the channel, consider joining our Patreon community. Fast flights on planes of all countries of the world, and soft landings to you.